Hello and welcome back to another episode of Round the Table from the Meeting Point, broadcasting not only to Bilbao but throughout the world. And this, as you have noticed, is episode 52. So today we are celebrating a whole year of podcasts, and we're pleased to announce that after much pondering and deliberation, it has been decided that we will continue with the weekly podcasts. This week also marks the beginning of a brand new trimester at the Meeting Point with our new book, designed especially for you, full of 12 exciting new topics, the first of which will be the subject of opinion. Now that's not going to appear in this podcast, that will be next week. All of the topics from now on will be 1 week behind the actual week of conversations in the class. So this week, for our monologue to begin with, we have the topic of why we need to talk. Also coming up in this episode, we've got another interesting word. We've also got your typical mistakes for this week. Well, it's a kind of a typical grammar problem that people have. We'll then be looking at a pronunciation problem. And then I've found another interesting object for you to look at. But first, let's talk about this. We, as a species, are not particularly big and strong. We can't run as fast as a great many other creatures, and we are not armed with sharp teeth and claws. It's a wonder that we have survived this long. What we do have is language, a means of communication far superior to that of any other animals. Sure, other animals have communication, a series of grunts and squeals to let each other know if they are angry or frightened, but not much beyond that. As humans, we can share complex information, we can share news and gossip, we can give advice and opinions, we can relate our experiences, tell stories and learn our history. We can teach each other and build the accumulated knowledge of our species. We can make plans and we can negotiate towards a better future. So, how do we learn a language? We learn by imitation. We hear our parents and those around us and we try to copy them. We build up our vocabulary and we subconsciously form the necessary grammar patterns. Later in life we are introduced to reading and writing, and then one day we might learn the grammar rules for the language we have already been speaking for many years. But how do we learn a second language? When we learn a second language, we begin with long lists of vocabulary, which may or may not be useful, and we study grammar. We learn this from a book, and we become accustomed to the written form of the word. Later, you might be exposed to a listening exercise or two, and maybe one day, if you are really lucky, you might get the chance to practice some speaking. It's all upside down. This is why we need to talk. Maybe it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said, "Small minds talk about people, average minds talk about things, great minds talk about ideas." A quality conversation can take many forms. Interesting discussions cover a wide range of topics, from day-to-day themes to more complex social issues. Sometimes the conversation can be quite light, full of amusing anecdotes, and sometimes we get more serious. However, We don't need to have any intellectual expertise to make a valid contribution to the debate. We don't have to be philosophers to discuss philosophy with a small p. We can have our own opinions about the concepts of happiness and success without having to know what Aristotle or Nietzsche had to say on the subject. We can discuss politics without the burden of political parties and politicians. Our views on education and welfare are just as valid as the opinions of those who make a career out of running the country. We don't need any special training to do a bit of psychology. We've all lived through our own highs and lows and met enough people along the way to have a basic understanding of the way the human mind works. The sharing of stories and ideas, the possibility of discussing and exchanging different opinions in an open and respectful environment is something sadly lacking in the modern world, yet it is a fundamental part of what makes us human. And remember, finding an answer to the question is not necessarily the goal. Sometimes the journey is more important than the destination. This is why we need to talk. Your interesting word this week is the word cast, which is a verb which means to throw. It's not often used as a verb to throw, but cast is throw. You can cast stones, for example. It means to throw. Now, if you like fishing, it's a very popular word amongst fishermen, because when you have a fishing rod and you use it to throw the hook out into the sea, that is called to cast. So it's a very popular verb amongst fishermen. You can also make some nouns from it. So a cast-off, which obviously is related to a phrasal verb, we have the noun cast-offs. So if you have clothes that you no longer want and you give them to someone else, especially younger brothers and sisters, they are called your cast-offs. There's also cast away. Originally it was like to throw away, but it was people that were left on islands because they were misbehaving on a ship. Imagine those old pirate days. People were left on tropical islands. So that film Castaway with Tom Hanks, he was not really a castaway in that film. He wasn't even in a shipwreck. It was a plane accident, I think. But that film should not be called Castaway, because a castaway was someone deliberately left on an island. So that's related to a phrasal verb, as is an outcast. If you are cast out of society, you are an outcast. So it's someone who is no longer welcome in society. In medieval times, it was often someone with a terrible disease like leprosy, and the people didn't want to be near them. So they were cast out of society and they became social outcasts. We can also use this verb cast when we pour a molten liquid into a mould. There's a type of metal called cast iron, which they pour it when it's liquid into a shape and then it goes hard into the shape that it's needed in. So that's called cast iron. You can do the same thing with what we call plaster of Paris, which is a white powder which you mix with water. It goes hard and then you can take a mould of something. And it's also the same plaster that is put on your arm or leg. If you break a bone, you can have your leg in a cast when they put that big white thing on your leg. to stop it moving. Now I hear you wonder, why do we have the cast of a play or a film? And why do we have a casting? Well, apparently that originally was referring to the distribution of the pieces of paper with all of the lines that the actors had to learn. That's why that is called a cast. It's to do with giving out the pieces of paper. And then you can be typecast. If you are an actor that always gets a very similar role, it's called typecasting. They always basically play the same character in all the different films they play. Now, here's a bit of history for you. If you go back in time, back into medieval times, before the invention of the seed drill by Jethro Tull in 1701, when they put the seeds on a field, when they distributed those seeds around the field to grow the corn, they just used to throw them around over a wide area because they didn't have the machine that put them in nice little rows. And if they threw it over a wide area, that was called broadcasting. Broad means wide and cast means throw. So when they threw the seeds around, that was called broadcasting, which later, in the 20th century, when they invented radios, that word was just reused. Like many of the words in technology, they're not really new inventions, they are old words that are reused. Recycled, as it were. So broadcasting then became what you do with a radio program. You broadcast it. And that is the middle B in the BBC, is the British Broadcasting Corporation. And then it went to television. Oh, and then they invented the iPod, and that's where the word podcast comes from. It's the mixture of broadcast and iPod. Now that was used in the 20th century. Then we have things like the forecast. The forecast, that for, of course, is related to before. So that was used to make predictions back in the 14th century. And then later, by the 19th century, it became more specific about predicting the weather. So now we have the weather forecast. Another thing you can cast is a spell. You can cast a spell when you do magic and you turn someone into a frog, for example, if you watch those sort of Disney cartoons. That is casting a spell. You can also cast doubt on something. If you make people doubt the truth of something, you can cast doubt on it. And you can also cast light, which can be real light or it can be metaphorical light, as in to illuminate someone and give them more information. You can cast light on something. Okay, so I think you'll agree that cast is a very interesting word. A couple of weeks ago we were discussing the word news, and I said that it always has an S on the end and it always takes a singular verb. So the news is good, the news is bad. And don't forget to use the pronoun it, not they. Don't say they are depressing, you say it is depressing when referring to the news. Here are some other words which follow a similar pattern. We have words like politics, economics, physics, linguistics, mathematics, ethics, athletics, and series. All of these words end in an S, but they are not plural. They just look like plural. So with all of these, you can say politics is interesting, economics is boring, physics is difficult, etc. Okay? And don't forget series, which is probably the most important one, which is the most common one for people to misuse. A lot of people say, I have been watching a series. No, you are watching a series. Even if it is one, it still has an S on the end. It is a series. The series is interesting. It is interesting. Okay, and it's pronounced series. And this word has also been a pronunciation problem this week. So the word is series, okay? Series. You got that soft R in the middle. Don't do the hard Spanish R, okay? And you don't pronounce the I and the E separately. Just say series, series. There's another word, serious, serious. Okay, it's got an extra syllable in the second part. Series, serious. And then we've got the word cities. Okay, now this can get confusing because if you say the word series, now some people will use a very strong Spanish R. The way the R is pronounced in Spanish is it's actually called a flap sound. You say series, series. Yeah, you got D. And it's very close to my letter D. Another thing that you'll hear is the T in the middle of a word, especially in the United States and some areas in Britain. The word city can be pronounced city. Okay? You'll see how similar that is. That T sound in America is the same as the R sound in Spanish, or it's very, very similar. So, when you're saying cities, you can say cities if you want to, but it might get confusing if you also say the word series in the same way. Okay? So you got series, you got serious, and you got cities or cities. It's not the same as CDs. Okay? Cities, CDs. You'll see if I say CDs, I'm pronouncing C and D with equal emphasis. So I'm saying C, not sit. I'm not saying cities, I'm saying CDs, like they're two separate things. Okay? Series, serious, cities, CDs. And now it's time for another episode of your favourite quiz show, What's the Difference? And this week we have 5 What's the Difference for you, 3 old favourites and 2 new ones that have recently come up in conversation. We have recipe, prescription, notice the pronunciation recipe, recipe and receipt, receipt, notice the pronunciation of receipt. And then we have receipt and bill, followed by extinct and extinguished, and a surplus and an excess. Okay, you might want to pause and write your answers or think about them, whatever you do. So number 1, recipe and prescription. The recipe is the instructions for cooking a dish or a cake. So instructions for cooking is a recipe. A prescription is something the doctor gives you and you take it to the pharmacy to get some medication. That is a prescription. Yes, those 2 words might have the same translation in Spanish. Now we have a recipe and a receipt. They're very similar words and people often get confused with these. And if you go back a few hundred years, they were the same thing. So recipe is the instructions for cooking, as I said. The receipt is the little piece of paper that says how much you paid. What you might call the ticket, but of course I don't call it a ticket. A ticket is for getting into a museum or travelling on a train or something like that. That is a ticket. So that is recipe and receipt. So what's the difference between receipt and bill? The difference is the receipt tells you how much you have paid and the bill tells you how much you are going to pay. So give yourself a point if you have those correct. Receipt and bill. Now the next one is extinct and extinguished. Extinct is describing an animal that no longer exists, like a dinosaur, or a dodo, or a woolly mammoth. Those animals are extinct. They're not extinguished. Okay? Extinguished describes a fire. When you put water on a fire, you extinguish it. Or you might use the phrasal verb put out. You can put out a fire. But extinguished can be a verb to extinguish. But we don't have a verb for extinct. You kill the animals, or you could kill off is the phrasal verb to make something extinct. But extinct doesn't seem to exist in a verb form, only as an adjective. So extinct for animals and extinguished for fire. The last one, number 5, is surplus and excess. They are both too much, but the first one is more positive. So if you are growing vegetables, imagine you grow lots of tomatoes. If you've ever tried growing vegetables, some years you have a lot of something and you have to give them to your neighbours. So when you've got lots of tomatoes, it's probably a surplus. More than you need, often sort of overproduction in that sort of context. An excess is more negative. So you could consume an excess of alcohol. You could be driving with an excess of alcohol in your blood. So they are both too much, but surplus is normally more than is required. Excess is more than you should have. They are kind of similar. So a possible 5 points there. I hope you got 5 out of 5. And now we have an interesting object. This is something I found in the river a few years ago. I suppose it's some kind of floor tile because it's got this sort of crossed pattern on it, which looks like a non-slip pattern. Too decorative, I think, to go on a roof because nobody would see it up there. And it looks like it's some kind of drain cover that might go on the floor. But I presume that it must be maybe inside a building, because if it was in the street, it would break if a lorry drove over it. So I don't think it would support the weight of traffic. Maybe it's okay for walking on. But anyway, if anybody out there knows what this mystery object is, I'd be glad to have more information. But it's very interesting, you must admit. And finally, before we go, we need an apology. In a previous episode, I told you that Epictetus was an Etruscan. Unfortunately, he was not an Etruscan, he was a Stoic. I know, completely different thing. I should check my source of information more thoroughly in future before sharing the information with you. But does it matter? It was a good excuse for me to write a new jingle for the apology. So I don't know if I'll be using that one again, but maybe I will. Next time I make a mistake, don't forget to leave a comment down below. Anyway, that's about all we have time for this week. Next week we will be beginning the first unit of the book, and we will be discussing the topic of opinions. So don't forget to share this video with all your friends. The more people that watch it, the more publicity we get. Leave a comment, do the thumbs up thing and all that kind of thing. And if I don't see you in class this week, tune in next week and we'll do it all again. So have a good week. Till next week. Bye.